They heard her voice first. A woman's laugh slid from the shadowed tree line like someone stepping out of memory. It sounded like the voice he'd woken to for years, the exact cadence, the private nickname she used in the dark. He sat up in his sleeping bag under a sky smeared with stars, frozen by the sound. The fire spat once and died. The voice called again, patient, coaxing. He answered. Then footsteps moved away from the campsite, quiet against dry leaves, and the forest closed over the sound. When the others woke, he was gone. His boots were empty at the edge of the ring of stones. A cigarette burned down to ash in the fire pit. There were no tracks beyond a narrow game trail, and the last phone ping showed a call from an unknown number with only a faint hiss of breathing on the line. Family members would later say the voice he followed was unmistakable. Neighbors and online forums would later give a name to that kind of mimicry: Skinwalker, a shapeshifter in local lore said to imitate the voices of loved ones. Officials, however, called it an open missing person case. This film tracks 7 such disappearances, cases where hikers and campers, alone in remote places, reported hearing voices that imitated someone they trusted. Each story is drawn from reported accounts, statements from deputies and rangers, and the fragments of calls, logs, and eyewitness recollections that survive. In every vignette, the same fragile pattern emerges: a familiar voice from the dark, a decision made in the split second between instinct and trust, and then a person who walks away and never comes back. We cannot say what happened to them. We will not claim supernatural causation. Witnesses reported mimicry. Investigators noted technological anomalies and inconclusive evidence. Family members lived with the silence. And yet, when those threads are laid side by side, a pattern, chilling in its repetition, begins to form. If you followed deep case investigations and the intersection of folklore with real-world disappearances, subscribe now. There are more of these stories to examine, and staying notified will mean you won't miss the rest. Vignette 1: The Campsite Call. He drove out for a single night to be alone. Work had been loud for months. The trailhead promised quiet. He left at dusk, a small backpack and a tent. The river cut through the valley like an old scar, water whispering over stones. He set up a fire, ate cold food, and put his phone on airplane mode because the signal was spotty and he wanted to sleep. At 2:13 a.m., his phone woke him. The screen flashed with a call from an unknown number. He answered, expecting the wind. Instead, there was breathing, long, measured, no words. He said hello, twice. Nothing but the breath, and then a noise that could have been a laugh or the wind through a hollow. He dove back into his bag for his flashlight. The beam found the dark like a white spear. At the tree line, a voice called his name. It sounded like his mother, the way she used to call him when he was a kid. The syllables were familiar in the geometry of memory. They carried a small, private cadence that no stranger should know. He stood up and listened. The voice called again, and this time he stepped toward it. His neighbor on the trail, who'd been bivouacked 100 yards away and later gave a statement to rangers, said he heard someone call and the reply, a single, soft voice, then a crunch of leaves as if a person had walked away. He shouted the hiker's name. The only answer was the river. By dawn, searchers found the campsite tidy but deserted. The tent collapsed, a sleeping bag zipped up, and a cup of coffee half full on the cooler. His phone's call log showed several short calls from the same unknown number in the 2 hours before he disappeared. One entry recorded a faint breath and then nothing. Rangers scoured the ridge. They found no bodies, no struggle, no sign the man had been dragged, no footprints beyond the first faint game trail. A trained search dog flagged a scent for 10 minutes, then lost it. Satellites showed no heat signature other than that first night's fire. A deputy's report would describe the scene as clean, as if someone left intentionally. Family members refused to accept that he'd simply walked away. They insisted the call had not been a prank, the breathing, the mimic, the precise way his name was said. Speculation followed the facts. Some neighbors offered a possible explanation: a prankster with a voice app, or a malicious caller spoofing numbers to scare campers. Technology can mask origins. Spoofed calls show digits that aren't the caller's. A police technician noted the unknown number had the hallmarks of number spoofing. It came and went from the logs, with only a faint carrier signal. But log anomalies are not proof of a person luring someone into the woods. They're proof of a broken trail of evidence. On screen, based on reported accounts and official recollections. Vignette 2, The Deserted Road, adapted from the Brandon Lawson reports. He was alone on a long stretch of road that runs between nowhere and a thin scattering of motels. It was late. He told dispatch he'd been lost, that he needed help. His phone records show a series of calls and an attempt to reach emergency services. One call was crisp in the log, 35 seconds that capture a single image. His breath sped, the road behind him a black line, and a voice from the brush calling his name. Listen to the dispatch excerpt as it was paraphrased for investigators. Dispatch audio paraphrase. Caller says there's someone in the bushes calling his name. He's out of the vehicle, walking toward the ditch. Caller sounds disoriented. The tape breaks into static and then silence. When deputies arrived, the truck's door was open. A small footprint of personal effects sat on the passenger seat. The keys were still in the ignition. No sign of a scuffle. Search parties with thermal cameras combed the ditch and the neighboring farm field for hours. At first light, volunteers picked through the tall grasses and drain culverts. They found a shoe a mile away, a faded scarf snagged on barbed wire. Years later, human remains discovered by a hiker in a drainage channel would be tentatively linked to the missing man through dental comparison, but cause and manner remained ambiguous in official notes. No definitive injuries matched the possibilities the area suggested: predation, misadventure, or foul play. Investigators never closed the loop on the last few minutes he was heard alive. Family members later spoke publicly about the calls he received the week before his disappearance: unknown numbers, breath-only calls, and messages with gaps of silence. Friends said the voice on the final night sounded like someone calling from inside the brush, low and intimate. Locals would later say the voice was the kind of mimicry associated with Skinwalker tales, an entity that copies the familiar to sow confusion. The sheriff's office did not endorse folklore. Their reports cataloged the facts and the gaps. They noted the pattern of calls to the man's phone and the digital anomalies, dropped pings, coordinates that shifted as if the GPS had a weak lock. Detectives considered the range of plausible explanations. There were those who thought he'd been followed by someone with the intent to harm. There were those who pointed to the region's history of imposters and people using burner phones to frighten or bait. There were also the hard, cold realities of fatigue and darkness. A man stumbling into a drainage channel, then the river carrying him away. But witnesses who knew his voice swore to a different thing, a voice that sounded too familiar to be random, beckoning him into a place where no one should go. Family members later spoke publicly about the calls he received the week before his disappearance: unknown numbers, breath-only calls, and messages with gaps of silence. Friends said the voice on the final night sounded like someone calling from inside the brush, low and intimate. Locals would later say the voice was the kind of mimicry associated with Skinwalker tales, an entity that copies the familiar to sow confusion. The sheriff's office did not endorse folklore. Their reports cataloged the facts and the gaps. They noted the pattern of calls to the man's phone and the digital anomalies, dropped pings, coordinates that shifted as if the GPS had a weak lock. Detectives considered the range of plausible explanations. There were those who thought he'd been followed by someone with the intent to harm. There were those who pointed to the region's history of imposters and people using burner phones to frighten or bait. There were also the hard, cold realities of fatigue and darkness. A man stumbling into a drainage channel, then the river carrying him away. But witnesses who knew his voice swore to a different thing, a voice that sounded too familiar to be random, beckoning him into a place where no one should go. Based on reported accounts and public records. Dispatch audio paraphrased. Vignette 3. The Riverside Trail. He'd come to the river to drown out a week's worth of bad decisions. A place to be alone where the sound of water meant no one could hear him and he didn't have to answer calls. He pitched his tent in a cedar grove, 200 yards from where a narrow trail met the water. The sky that night was dry. A moth skittered against his headlamp. At 1:06 a.m., his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize flashed the screen, then disconnected. He called back and got only a faint scrape of breathing. The sound sent him outside, half-dressed, shoes scraping cold dirt. He walked toward the trail where he'd hung his wet jacket to dry. Near the bend, a child's laugh echoed in his ears. The same laugh that had been on another call that week, one he'd ignored because he thought it was spam. The laugh was a lure. It was small and high, like a sound designed to be recognized by a stomach that wanted to protect, to go to. The voice called out the name of a niece he'd lost custody of 2 years earlier. The man, shaken, said he heard the child's exact giggle and one line, "Uncle, come see," and he followed without thinking. Those who later examined his phone records noticed that the incoming numbers matched patterns used in criminal nuisance calls: multiple prefixes, short-duration connections, and a series of brief silent calls recorded by the carrier. The group he'd joined earlier that day returned the next morning to the trailhead. They found his jacket hung from a sapling and a trail of wavering footprints toward the riverbank where the ground dropped into a thick stand of reeds. Searchers waded in with poles and dogs. They found a single shoe, mud-caked and empty, lodged among cattails. The man's watch was recovered downstream, still ticking. Police interviewed local hunters. One told officers he'd seen a slender figure moving through the reeds at dawn, stepping lightly over exposed roots. Another reported a car parked at a pullout he'd never seen before. None of those tips yielded a suspect. The county coroner later wrote that the most plausible explanations included accidental death in swift water or abduction. The family, grieving, looked at the timestamps and the audio logs and wondered if someone had used the timing of his loneliness and a voice he trusted to get him to the place where he'd be vulnerable. Skeptics suggested natural causes: misheard animal calls, the mind inventing the voice of a remembered child when in a state of exhaustion or grief. Investigators kept both tracks open. Meanwhile, in campfire conversations around the basin, older residents told a different story, of a thing in the high country that imitates the small, intimate sounds of home so that people will walk into the dark. The name changed by county line. The behavior remained the same. On screen, based on reported eyewitness accounts and investigative statements. Vignette 4. The Trailhead Stranger Group Hike Gone Wrong. They were a group of 5, seasoned enough to laugh at the trail map, close enough to share gas and snacks. They parked at the usual pullout and joked about bears. They left one car keys, deleted, and returned to it at dusk with sore feet and a cooler full of beer. They remembered the man they'd passed at the trailhead that morning. Weathered jacket, a cigarette between his fingers, a look that didn't fit the route. They didn't read him as dangerous. A stranger can be part of the background of a trail town. At night, by the embers of a small burn, the man from the trailhead appeared in a stranger's memory and shifted into something else. One hiker, a woman named Elle, would later tell rangers she woke to someone calling her boyfriend's name, the sort of low, intimate sound lovers only use late at night. Her friend said the time was around 11:40 p.m. when the group was deep in sleep. Elle sat up, disoriented, and shouted without thinking, "Who is that?" The voice answered from beyond the ring of trees. It knew his name. It called him softly. He unzipped his tent and walked out toward the sound. In a half-minute, the group was awake and searching with flashlights, calling his name. They saw nothing but a faint trail of footprints leading away from the campsite and vanishing at a ridge. One friend tried to follow, but his phone died where the ingress road drops into a pocket of dead signal. They called 911 and got a dispatcher who heard the fear in their voices. Dispatch excerpt, recreated for clarity. Caller says a member of their party walked off after hearing someone call his name from the woods. No visual. They're at the trailhead parking, Route 12. Units en route. The short dispatch record bore out what the hikers remembered. Someone had walked away into the dark after hearing a voice they trusted. The immediate ground search turned up nothing. The hikers' boots were at the campsite. A bead of sweat caught on the inside brim of his cap. The group's oldest friend would later tell investigators he suspected foul play. That stranger from the morning had been watching them, had returned after dark, had wanted to separate one person from the cohort. The sheriff's office interviewed the stranger the next day. He claimed to have been passing through and to have had nothing to do with the disappearance. He had a story, an alibi, and the blank space of a cigarette purchase receipt to show he'd been elsewhere. No charges were filed. What investigators could document was the phone behavior of the missing hiker. The phone showed a final outbound call to a number listed only as unknown. The call lasted 12 seconds. The group's final frantic calls to 911 recorded shouts, the scrape of feet, and a line where sound ceased, as if a microphone had been submerged. Days later, the family received a text from the hiker's number, reading nothing more than a single dash. Forensic analysts would later note that push-button phones and primitive voice recording applications can be manipulated to simulate a person's voice. The digital space is porous. But the friends who shared the trail with him said something else in quiet voices, that he had gone because the voice sounded like the one he loved. His partner's laugh, the private way she would call him from the kitchen. That familiarity, they said, was what made him walk. The fact that he was a member of a group, that there were witnesses who saw him answer the call and then disappear, tightened the wound. It suggested not just isolation, but entrapment of a different, more social kind. On screen, based on interviews with companions and official search reports. The patterns so far. Across these first accounts, certain motifs thread together like a seam. The lure is not brute force, but intimacy. Small, recognizable sounds that belong in someone's memory rather than in the mouth of a stranger. Calls come from unknown numbers, or the line carries only breathing and faint laughter. Phones fail at crucial moments. Dead batteries, dead zones, brief calls that disappear from logs. Search teams arrive to organized scenes. A cup on a cooler, a jacket on a sapling, a shoe at the waterline. Witnesses sometimes report seeing eyes at the tree line, or a shadow moving away. Deputies note spoofs or phone anomalies. Coroners file reports that speak of inconclusive causes. Families keep vigil around missing beds. There is another motif, the collision of folklore and the practical. Where communities have stories of voice-mimicking creatures, those stories slip into explanations. Where investigators find nothing, families and neighbors fill the space with narrative. That time in the forest when a person makes a choice between staying with the group or stepping into the voice, that is the moment these stories orbit. It is not always a moment captured by forensics, and it's rarely preserved in the neat language of police reports. It is a small, decisive moment, private and irreversible. Yet, these are not purely tales of the uncanny. For every neighbor who tells of a skinwalker, there is a detective who catalogs cell tower pings and points out that numbers can be spoofed and voices can be mimicked by technologies or by careful, malicious people. For every campfire account of glowing eyes, there is a coroner who writes of drowning and exposure. We must sit with both. We must also recognize what technology can do to both create and erase trails. One man's phone showed a series of short calls from a range of unfamiliar numbers in the hours before he walked off. Another's recorded a last outbound call to a number that returned only silence. In one case, the carrier provided a matrix of pings that led nowhere. The phone that once promised rescue now sits as an artifact of misdirection, a weak light in an otherwise dark world. The stories so far suggest multiple possible threads. Predation by another human, a cruel and targeted campaign of harassment using modern telephony, fatal accidents after a confused walk into rough terrain, or phenomena that fit within local myth, mimicry that preys on attachment. Each explanation can account for some, but not all, of the evidence. And for families, the unsatisfying truth is that partial answers still feel like none at all. On screen, based on reported accounts and field logs from responding units. The next accounts move into cases where mimicry meets deception directly, where calls contain background noises meant to reassure, where a lure is created not only by a voice but by contextual detail that sounds authentic, like the clatter of dishes or the hush of a house. In one instance, a voice on the line sounded like a child playing in the background. In another, a driver circled the parking area for hours before a hiker answered a call and walked into the night. The pattern becomes more complicated there. Are these the work of a person exploiting grief and memory, or do they fit a geometry of something older and stranger? There is one voice, however, that keeps returning in the interviews and logs. Not a single recorded word, but a type of intimacy. The laugh that could be no one else's, the nickname whispered from the dark. It is the same small human detail that turns an ordinary walk into a perilous choice. At the edge of the fourth vignette, investigators are left with a map of absence. They have stretches of land, timestamps, and a handful of items recovered in places that suggest a person's last silent movements. Families have the echoes of calls, the image of a loved one moving away into dark trees. And communities have stories that do one of two things. They either bind these events together under a familiar rubric, a cautionary tale of the wild, or they become the ground where the most painful question grows. What do you do when the person calling your name is not who you think they are? On screen, based on reported interviews and investigative summaries. Sound lowers to a single slow drone. Pause. The next story begins with a birthday celebration in a cabin up the ridge, an event meant to be joy turned into an engineered absence. There is a caller who knows the honoree's favorite song, who hums the opening bars, and a partygoer who steps outside and never returns. The way the caller blended personal details with the ambient noise of the night convinced witnesses the call was intentional. Detectives would later cite the incident as an example of how trust can be weaponized in remote settings. And they would note again the phone's behavior. A series of calls from numbers that could not be traced, lines that offered only a faint human breath before going dead. But before we can press into that birthday night, we follow another thread. A camper in the Catskills who claimed to have seen eyes and a hand beckoning, and who later became a central figure in regional lore about voice-mimicking creatures. His account is one of the few in these 7 that directly intersects with the local term Skinwalker. He will appear because his story is a hinge between documented disappearance and the folklore that frames it. On screen. Based on reported accounts, some details adapted for narrative clarity. The sound drops to near silence and the drone lingers. Footsteps in the dark. A faint, almost imperceptible laugh. Vignette 5. Fairest and the Catskills beckoning. They called him Fairest in the little towns that sit like punctuation along the state routes. He'd grown up in the hollows and slept under open sky whenever he could. After a divorce and a year of small losses, he found himself alone on a narrow ridge in the Catskills, a sleeping pad on the bare earth, a headlamp and a thermos. He kept to himself. He kept a small shrine of photographs under his pack, a practice that looked like superstition to some and like tenderness to others. The night he left the ridge with the photograph still tucked under his shirt, the wind was thin and everything smelled like stone. He later told friends he felt watched even before the sound began, a pressure at the back of his neck, a ripple in the quiet. Around midnight, his phone, tucked in the pocket of his jacket, rang. The screen lit with an unusual number he didn't recognize. In small, static-laced audio, he heard a phrase that made him sit up. It wasn't a human voice, he said later. It was something that had learned to fold itself into human speech. He described two red points of light peering over a boulder across the clearing, like a pair of slow coals. A hand, long and quick as a thought, lifted from the brush and made a small beckoning motion. The voice called his name, the way his sister had years before, a private nickname slipping out of the dark. For a breath, he thought it was a neighbor. He rose from his pad to answer. "I saw the eyes," he told a park ranger in a later interview, voice low. "They were right there on the rock. They called me like a lullaby. It fit into me, and I almost walked up to them." He did not walk forward. He turned and ran, he said, sprinting along the trail, the cold tearing at his lungs. Behind him, he swore he could still hear the voice, patient, coaxing. He reached the road and found a trucker who gave him a ride to the next town. He reported the encounter to a park official the next day. He was frightened to the point of shaking. He drew scribbles in a notebook for the ranger, 2 dots, an arc of motion, a rustle like clothing. Over the following months, Ferrist became a character in the local landscape of fear. Campfires along the ridge carried versions of his story. Eyes, a hand, the voice with the sister's laugh. He took to sleeping with his photographs under his pillow and leaving lights burning. He posted messages on a regional forum warning others to trust only the light of their own campfires. Some people called him a man traumatized into pattern seeing. Others began to give theory, in whispers, to those who would listen by lantern. Police logs show a different, more formal side of those months. Rangers reported his report. They noted a lone caller in a nearby campground who mentioned a creature with glowing eyes. They logged a follow-up patrol that found no tracks beyond the rock where Ferrist said he'd seen the lights. In time, other reports trickled in. Night drivers who said they spotted fleeting reflections in the tree line. Hunters who refused to go into certain hollows late after dusk. None of the incidents produced physical evidence beyond scuffed leaf litter and a weathered footprint or two that could belong to deer. Ferrist's account hardened into a piece of regional lore. For the families already grieving someone gone, it offered a vocabulary, a term for that ache, a name for the uncanny thing that imitated intimacy. Locals began to use the lore to warn children. Don't go where the voice sounds like home. But for investigators, the file remained open and thin. No body was found, no DNA, no witness who could place a person in a given place and time. Ferrist himself later relayed a string of calls he had received in the months after his sighting, numbers that delivered only breathing, or a laugh that started and died mid-note. He would say, with a weariness in his throat, that the calls felt like the echo of something learning. There are natural explanations worth listing. Many animals reflect light and can give the impression of eyes in the dark. Headlamp glare can be misread. Exhaustion and isolation make the brain knit together meaning from scraps of sound. There are also grimly practical explanations. Pranksters, people armed with cheap amplification, hunters with flashlights. But Ferrist's telling mattered for reasons beyond proof. It anchored a particular kind of fear, the fear that the forest can speak in the voice of someone you love, and that trust can be weaponized in an instant. He would remain a person who had seen or thought he'd seen something that replaced his certainty with a question. He would carry, for years, the weight of having walked back from the line where many others did not. His story would stitch itself into the chorus of other accounts where mimicry intersects with disappearance, and it would be cited by neighbors as the county's example of the thing people called, in later nights, a skinwalker. On screen, based on reported accounts and ranger recollections. Vignette 6. The Birthday at the Cabin. Remote cabins invite a kind of temporary family. This one sat at the end of a gravel road, a circle of weathered boards and a porch light that flickered in a gust. They drove up for a birthday, a small group of friends, a cake, A stereo leaned against a milk crate for music. The honoree was known for his laugh and for leaving a door unlocked for friends. The night offered too much liquor and too little sleep. Around 10:30 p.m., while the group sang through the last chorus of a favorite song, a call came on the host's phone. Witnesses later said the caller knew the honoree's nickname and, for a second, hummed the opening bars of a song only his inner circle associated with him. The voice on the phone sounded close to a childhood memory, the way an aunt used to signal him from the kitchen. A friend later said she watched him smile at the phone and step out onto the porch to answer. He answered and walked away, she told investigators, like he couldn't help it. He said, "I'll be right back," and then he was gone. The porch light threw a narrow cone across the gravel. Where he had stood was a small patch of disturbed dirt. Friends checked the roadside and the shallow bank below the drive. They called and called. When no answer came, someone dialed 911. Officers came and searched the area well into the night. The search turned up empty. No footprints beyond the first faint trail, no sign of a struggle, a single soda can crushed near the culvert. The police seized phones for analysis. The initial forensic summary, returned weeks later, listed a series of calls from different, untraceable numbers to the man's line in the hours preceding his disappearance. Some calls registered only as interruptions, rings that broke off before a connection could be logged. One entry recorded a brief sound pattern that the analyst described as breathing and an intermittent hum, but the note cautioned that the carrier's recording quality was insufficient for conclusive interpretation. Detectives exploring the social context found possible motives that were pedestrian and cold. There were acquaintances with drug problems and evidence of distribution in other parts of the county. A neighbor reported seeing strangers loitering near the lane several nights before. Police later said they found paraphernalia near a disused outbuilding on a property a mile away. That discovery suggested that criminal exploitation could be in play, someone using the cover of remote gatherings to bait or isolate a target. Investigators ran down leads in both familiar directions, organized predation and the darker outlines of prank-driven cruelty. Family members insisted the call had been intimate in a way a stranger couldn't replicate, the way the voice had hesitated before the nicknames, the cadence of the hum. Friends whispered about technology that could imitate voices, apps that could stitch samples into convincing phrases. Smart voices, they feared, could now be invented to sound like safe things. The investigation could neither confirm nor deny the presence of voice manipulation tools. The carrier handed over logs that showed connections and drops, but no single device was positively identified as the source. Months later, in the quiet left behind, the absence took on ritual. The birthday table became a shrine, the cake an uncut artifact. The friends spoke rarely of that night without a tremor. Some left the county. Others camped less frequently. They carried a new caution about a world where familiarity could be staged and used as a hook. On screen, based on reported accounts and investigative summaries. Vignette 7. The driver who was called. Delivery drivers live on edge in a way many of us do not know. Their routes carve through industrial lots and back roads. Their work leaves them alone in the hours when other people sleep. One such driver, a part-time hiker who liked to park and watch sunrise on his off days, described in interviews with friends and to a sheriff a period of weeks in which a white pickup seemed to follow him. The truck would pass slowly, windows up, then circle back in the lane behind the gas station. The tedium of work became a texture of being watched. On one night, after a long shift, he chose to sit for a while at an overlook. Headphones off so he could hear the highway. His phone buzzed. An unknown number displayed, then connected. On the line, he heard a low voice call his name, the exact pronunciation his younger brother used when trying to wake him for school. He froze. The pasture below the overlook was black as spilled ink. The truck headlights blinked somewhere far back on the county road. He told a local deputy later that he felt the air change, like a presence approaching from the brush. He answered the call and stepped down the embankment, toward a line of trees. A friend who shared the job with him received a text not long after. A single cryptic note. Gone. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. Hours later, a passerby found a single sneaker on the shoulder of the road. Search teams worked the ditch lines, the culverts, the chain-link fences. They found a shattered taillight that matched the description of the truck he'd seen circling, but the vehicle itself eluded immediate identification. Dispatch excerpt, recreated for clarity. Caller reports male possibly walking off from scenic overlook after receiving a call. Believes vehicle present may be related. Caller was last known to be heading toward County Road 5. Units en route. Advise caution. The deputy's notebook recorded a pattern of harassment. Multiple reports from drivers in the area about the same truck passing by late at night. Rumors on a driver's forum suggested others had received anonymous calls designed to unsettle. The sheriff's office coordinated with the motor carrier that employed the missing man, but found no sign of internal conflict. The investigation widened to include surveillance requests at nearby gas stations and plate checks on suspicious vehicles. One lead pointed to a motorist with a history of aggressive behavior, but surveillance placed that individual elsewhere on the night in question. Witness accounts began to fracture. A witness at a diner claimed to have seen the driver the night he vanished, bellied up to the counter, then leaving alone. Another placed him with company. Phones in the area registered brief handoffs between cell towers that evening, making the exact location fuzzy. Forensic examiners concluded the evidence was too circumstantial to support a single definitive scenario. Abduction, misadventure after a disoriented walk, or an attack staged by someone who used the pattern of calls to separate him from light and help. In the months after his disappearance, there were reports of someone matching his description seen walking along a rural stretch 3 counties away, of calls to his family from numbers that mimicked his voicemail prompt. Those leads led nowhere conclusive. The family remained in a state of suspended grief, fielding messages and sightings, keeping hope alive in the only ways they could: vigils, posted flyers, and a slow accrual of small, stubborn actions that felt like work against loss. On screen, based on reported accounts and sheriff's office logs. Patterns revisited. What the cases share. Across the 7 vignettes, the lone camper with the breathing call, the man on a deserted highway whose last words were confusion, the riverbank where a laugh turned into a vanished footprint, the hiker who stepped away from a circle of friends, Ferrist and the eyes on the rock, the birthday cabin where a song unstitched a party, and the driver who was called into the dark. Certain features repeat with uncanny persistence. The lure is intimate. The voice is not generic. It borrows nicknames, private cadences, household refrains. It operates at the intersection of memory and sound. The decisions made in response are private, performed inside a second or two where familiarity can be trusted more than caution. Phones are both tool and trick. They ring, they breathe, they fail. They sometimes reveal a pattern of untraceable numbers, dropped pings, and short-duration calls. In other cases, they go dead at the most consequential time. Battery exhausted, tower out of range, signal gone. Investigations reveal a second layer where human agency might explain the phenomenon. People who wish to harm can weaponize the intimacies of sound. Spoofed numbers are cheap. Voice recording and synthesis tools are increasingly accessible. Criminals with local knowledge can select a target's attachments and use borrowed details, a song, a childhood nickname, to lure. In a region where cell service is uneven and roads run far between, separating one person from the light of the group is easier than it would be in a city. Psychology also provides explanation without malice. The human brain is wired to pattern match and to prioritize socially relevant sound. In states of exhaustion, grief, or isolation, imagination and perception can merge. Animal noises and the absence of other human signals can be misread as voices, especially when memory supplies content that fits: a mother's cadence, a partner's laugh. The wilderness itself shapes perception. Wind through hollows, an owl's call, a distant truck's engine note can be folded into something like speech. And there is folklore. The term Skinwalker, used in a few of these communities to describe a voice-mimicking presence, carries centuries of local stories about shapeshifts and deception. Where empirical trails end, folklore supplies an interpretive frame. It is important to be clear, naming does not prove causation. It does, however, shape how communities process absence, grief, and fear. Giving the phenomenon a name can give families a narrative, a ritual, and a set of cautions that feel protective in the face of unknowns. None of these explanations fully resolves the cases. Each can account for certain pieces of evidence, but not all. A spoofed number explains strange call logs, but not the sighting of eyes on a rock. A misheard animal call can explain a vanished footstep captured at dawn, but not the pattern of targeted calls to a specific person's phone across a week. Human predation explains many criminal behaviors, but cannot be confirmed in cases with no physical trail. What is consistent, however, is the aftermath. Families are left with fragmentary evidence and hollow places at meals and beds. Responders carry the echoes of unanswered calls and the memory of searching through hollows and along rivers. Communities stitch these events into cautionary tales. Be careful with your device, do not respond to unknown calls at night, travel in numbers, and also sometimes into lore that speaks to something older and more uncanny than our technologies. Investigative gaps and the limits of evidence. Law enforcement repeatedly returns to the same problems in these cases: limited forensic material, the erosive power of wild terrain, and the gaps that technology both creates and cannot bridge. A phone may show a call, but the carrier's records can only report the numerical artifacts that were logged. Spoofing can hide the originator. A trail can vanish under weather. A witness can be mistaken. Time corrodes certainty. Even when remains are recovered, as happened in one of the earlier cases, cause and manner can remain ambiguous. Decomposition, scavenger activity, and environmental dynamics erase the clear markers detectives rely upon. In several incidents, sheriff offices cataloged multiple plausible scenarios in their files, but closed none conclusively. That procedural incompletion leaves families without the closed loop that permits mourning to rest somewhere other than in perpetual question. When investigators did find human suspects, results were mixed. Some leads pointed to individuals with histories of stalking or violent behavior. Other leads traced to youth pranks or transient strangers who could not be placed definitively. Tools like phone forensics, surveillance footage, witness interviewing, and canine search teams are powerful but not omnipotent. The wilderness is an equalizer that strips straightforward narratives and leaves only fragments to be assembled by inference, interpretation, and sometimes committed belief. The role of technology, a double-edged sword. Technology threads through nearly every vignette. It is both a promise of rescue and an instrument of misdirection. Phones ring. They display numbers that look native. They deliver fragments of sound, breath, laughter, a hum. Mobile networks can map a general area of location through tower pings, but in rural regions, those pings can cover wide spaces, creating uncertainty about a caller's precise position. Battery life, dead zones, and the physical destruction of a device all erase trails. Meanwhile, techniques exist to mask the origin of a call and to stitch together a voice from samples. Such tools are increasingly accessible to non-experts. That reality complicates the moral universe of these cases. Technology that one trusts for safety can be used against you. The human reaction to that possibility is palpable. In several of the incidents we covered, investigators flagged potential spoofing and suggested that calls may have been engineered to suggest intimacy. Family members tended to weigh that against their memory of the voice's particularity. Neighbors often favored the older, interpretive frameworks of folklore. The coexistence of all these interpretations is part of why the cases remain unresolved in public imagination. Evidence alone rarely answers the question of motive, and motive is what transforms a call into a crime. What families and first responders remember. If there is a through line that is more human than theory, it is this: The loss is private, and the memory of the moment when a loved one walked away is indelible. Families speak not of the forensic gaps, but of a chair that holds a shape at dinner, a phone that rings and never stops being empty, a cousin who used to cut the crusts off a birthday cake. First responders speak of the thin hours after a disappearance, when the forest feels like a mouth closing. They remember the sound of a child's voice on a 911 line that cuts off mid-breath, and the way sunlight looks on an abandoned campsite. Rangers and deputies who worked these cases shared a common difficulty in interviews: the tension between empathy and evidence. They want to help. They also must maintain standards of proof. That tension is not failure. It is the structure of public protection. In their notebooks, they catalog the items found, the call logs, the list of plausible suspects. In their memories, they hold the face of someone who answered a voice and did not return. A law enforcement officer who had walked miles of the ridge with a searcher once told a reporter, "Most of what we do is turn over every stone. What we can't do is turn back the night." There are choices people make, sometimes in a single breath, that neither patrol cars nor lights can reverse. His phrase echoed across several interviews. Responders can document what they find. They cannot always explain why a person chose, in that instant, to go. Responsibility and caution, practical and ethical. These stories raise ethical questions about how communities talk about absence and danger. Spreading a cautionary tale about unknown calls is sensible. Romanticizing an explanation that ascribes agency to folklore can comfort some but confuse investigations for others. Investigators warn against hysteria. Families warn against complacency. Public messaging must thread a careful needle. Inform people that spoofing and malicious callers exist, that technology can be compromised, and that wilderness hiking has real hazards. Advise companions and tell people to travel in numbers, carry reliable lighting and charged devices, and leave plans with someone. Yet avoid turning every unexplained event into a sensational tale that may harm those who are grieving. We must also resist temptation to instruct curiosity seekers on how to recreate or summon the phenomena. The narrative below does not provide any guide to interacting with alleged entities. It does, however, encourage prudence. Report suspicious calls to law enforcement, document strange behavior, and prioritize safety when isolated. Closing: what we keep with us. You have heard 7 accounts that share a single, devastating hinge: a voice that sounds like someone the missing person loves, and a choice made in response to that voice. Whether the voices were the product of human cruelty or sonic illusion, of grief-warped perception or something that lies outside our categories of explanation, the outcome is the same. Families live with an open space at their tables. Responders walk with questions. Communities exchange warnings that feel at once modern and ancient. These stories do not give us answers. They ask us to hold several possibilities at once. They invite us to consider the real mechanics of modern harassment: spoofed numbers, synthesized voices, targeted campaigns, alongside the older human capacity for myth. They ask us to think about how we act when called by the sound of someone we love. And they press us toward an important moral commitment: to treat missing people not as legends, but as people, to continue searches, to press carriers and agencies for clarity, and to support families who will, in most cases, receive a tidy resolution. If you are watching because you search for pattern and answer, remember that the wild is not a courtroom and the heart is not a hard drive. These files contain whispers of both human malice and hard-to-catalog phenomena. They contain, above all, absence. Final on-screen note and resources. This program presents reported accounts and investigative recollections. Some details have been adapted for narrative clarity. Sources include interviews with family members and companions, public records from sheriff's offices and park rangers, and public dispatch logs. In cases where specifics were not independently verifiable, descriptions were given with qualifying language and an emphasis on patterns rather than forensic determination. If this episode touched you and you want to explore more reported cases and folklore deep dives, watch our playlist on missing person cases and regional myths, and consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future investigations. If you or someone you know is currently missing, or if you need support with grief, please contact local authorities immediately. For emotional support, consider reaching out to national resources such as the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, call or text 988 in the United States, or local victim support services. If you are in immediate danger, call 911. Credits and disclaimer. On-screen credits. Based on reported accounts and official recollections, some narrative adaptations for clarity. Production notes. Dispatch audio excerpts used in this program were recreated for narrative clarity and are indicated as paraphrased or recreated where used. This program does not claim that a supernatural explanation is proven in any case. The goal is investigative, to present reported phenomena and the human consequences that follow. Acknowledgements. Thanks to the families, friends, first responders, deputies, and rangers who shared recollections and records. Their willingness to speak is the foundation of this investigation. Final image. A ring of stones at dawn, a single cup of coffee cooling, a pair of boots by a tent. A muted, respectful tableau that honors absence without sensationalism. Watch next. To continue exploring reported disappearances, layered investigations, and folklore that shapes local understanding of missing person cases, follow our playlist linked at the end of this video. If this episode helped you understand the nuances of these investigations, subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be alerted when the next deep dive drops. Trigger warning. This episode deals with missing person cases and may be distressing. If you need help processing this material, please reach out to local support services. On screen. For sources and further reading, see the video description.